Good afternoon, and again, thank you for being here as well. My name is Michael Proctor. I'm a site reliability engineer in the public cloud enablement team in Chase. Been with the firm for 25 years, which is great because there's a lot of different roles. By way of quick introduction, I've started programming in Fortran on punch cards when I was at university in South Africa, and at that point, resiliency and redundancy were putting two rubber bands around the deck of cards you had and making sure you had a paper copy saved somewhere else.
Excellent, Michael. Thank you for being with us. Okay, so before we dive into those two stories that I mentioned, we're going to do a quick customer survey here. I want to find out a little bit about your needs and what brought you to this particular session today. So I've got 3 questions we'd like to start with. So question number 1 is, within the last 6 months, how many of you within your teams have dealt with a major IT outage that lasted more than 1 hour? Just raise your hand so I can see how many have dealt with those kind of incidents. Okay, fair number. My second question for you is, of those systems that experienced those outages, how many of them were classified as business critical systems by your business and by the users? Okay, fair number. My third question for you is, for those systems, had you done monitoring testing, chaos resiliency testing that should have captured the particular failure mode that presented during that failure? Okay? All right, so we're going to look at some market data in a moment that suggests that the number of these outages of critical systems and the duration of how long it takes to recover from them, there's probably more of them and they take longer to recover from than you perhaps might expect, and what we can do about that. Okay? So we're going to go through this today in 4 different sections. We're going to talk about the needs for these type of critical applications, what you need to make them more reliable. We're going to go through the release of this new service called AWS Support Incident Detection and Response, which, by the way, is quite a mouthful. So you're probably going to hear me use the acronym IDR for the rest of that talk. Whenever I say IDR, that means the new AWS service for incident detection and response. We're going to move from that to, again, the story of how Chase was one of the first major customers of that and the benefits they've seen as a result. And then finally, we're going to talk about some things that we think you can take away to help make your applications more resilient and to have less incidents and recover from incidents more quickly. Okay, so let's start with a quote, because we always like to start these talks with a quote. And this one happens to be, as you can see, from Sun Tzu in The Art of War. This particular talk is all about preparedness. It's about preparedness for critical situations and for IT incidents in specific. And this particular quote, I think, has some important things to say about preparedness. Okay? And so what the quote is saying is, if you only know yourself, or in this case your workload, and the failure modes it's subject to, on a surface level, you're going to have probably some bad outcomes. Okay? If you understand the workload and the failure modes it's subject to on a deeper level, you're going to have much better outcomes. And you're going to be able to take what might be unexpected events or incidents and turn them into things that are expected and more routine, things that you can recover from more quickly. Okay? So we're going to talk about preparedness through the lens of a number of mechanisms, reviews architecturally and operationally that you do up front, through the automation of deployment and management, through better monitoring and alerting, and through things like chaos testing, okay? And how a service like RDR can help drive and enforce those types of best practices. Okay, so at AWS, you like to work backwards from customer requirements and what customers need. So what have customers told us in this particular space? Customers tell us that despite their attempts to build resilient systems, and despite putting a lot of effort into implementing monitoring and alerting for those systems, that most frequently their first indication that a critical incident is evolving is when customers start telling them that they have a problem and start reporting things into their help desks, which is obviously not the reactive posture that any of us want to be in for our customers. Once the incident has begun, the amount of time it takes to dive into that and understand the root cause and what's happening is far longer than they or their users can tolerate. The frequency of these incidents is much higher than is desired, and that erodes their trust and reliability of their systems with their customers. And so they really are looking for solutions to help them reduce the frequency and the duration of these incidents. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's quantify some of those customer quotes that we just went through. There was a market study done earlier this year by IDC, which had some interesting findings. They looked at large enterprises, like many of you probably work for, and what they found was that the average enterprise is experiencing over 29 of these sorts of incidents per year, okay, over 2 a month. As somebody who works as a technical account manager helping customers avoid and respond to such incidents, that's obviously way too high a number. Very interestingly, they found that on average, it takes 5 hours to recover from one of these incidents. We're going to explore today, why is that? Why would it take so long for a system that's probably been through tons of testing, has tons of alarms defined for it? Why does it take 5 hours to realize something is going wrong, fix it, or avoid the problem from escalating further? Finally, the cost to those organizations for remediating those sequence of events runs in the order of $13.5 million per organization per year. I don't know what size your organization is, what size your IT budget is, but $13.5 million is a lot of money to me anyway. Imagine what you could do using that money to invest in inventing better solutions and improving your solutions on behalf of your users and your customers. So disruptions are costly. There's some that you can quantify. There are others that are more difficult to quantify, but they are every bit as important. So we're going to talk about some secondary impacts. This picture here in the lower right-hand corner, you can see the poor operations guy that's trying to hold up the falling domino of effects that's happening during one of these incidents, right? So the question there is, what level of burnout do you have in your staff from these multiple incidents that are happening per year? How much attrition does that drive of valuable skills across your organization? How much time do you spend trying to hire people to replace those people who have burnt out and moved on to another job? That's one sort of secondary impact. There's reputational damage, okay? We talked about customers getting fed up with repeat incidents, right? I'm sure you've all heard the quote that says, a reputation takes a lifetime to earn and a moment to lose. Very difficult to quantify the cost of that. If you work in regulated environments, as our customer here does, there's cost associated with those incidents when you meet certain reporting timeframes and recovery timeframes. And again, there's cascading effects down your chain of your partners and others that use your system who get impacted by these incidents as well. All right, so that's the problem statement. Why is this important? Why do we need to reduce the frequency? Why do we need to reduce the cost of this? So what's the solution? Okay, so this service that we developed, which we're going to call IDR here today, it went into general availability just a month or so ago in September, if you haven't seen that yet. So this service, at its essence, is AWS and the customer, a specific application team, working together to define a set of alerts that are leading indicators of problems with that particular workload. And so then we set up automation to detect those failure modes, and we feed those not only to the customer's operation teams and consoles, but we also feed them directly into AWS's internal incident management systems and incident management engineers. So effectively, what you are getting is the ability to benefit from the same type of rich monitoring and incident management that we apply internally to our AWS services, as well as we apply externally to AWS managed services customers that some of you may be. And so you can benefit from that type of response time and detection. By having that automation in place and agreeing on those signals and alarms, it gives us the ability to commit to having an incident spun up with the right AWS resources on it in 15 minutes or less. Now that might sound similar initially to if you're enterprise support customers today, you know that when you open a critical, the highest level support case, there's also a 15-minute response time objective for those. The difference is the clock on that starts when you open the support case. The clock on an IDR incident begins when the system detects degradation or problems in your system. And our experience is that lag between when a system detects a problem with your application and when it actually gets diagnosed and a support case gets opened is very significant. We're going to look at how significant in a minute. So that's the difference between enterprise support and IDR, which is an add-on offering which enterprise support customers can purchase, and our AWS managed services customers that have enterprise support get IDR as a default part of their service. Okay, so how does onboarding to this service work? So we said before in our opening quote, the most important thing is to know yourself, know your workload, and know the failure modes. So the very first thing that we do is, hopefully if this workload is in production or near to it, you've gone through a set of architectural and operational reviews using something like the AWS well-architected framework. If that hasn't happened for whatever reason for this particular workload that we're onboarding to IDR, then we'll work with you and go through that review, make sure that we understand the key solutions, dependencies, failure modes, monitoring, etc. The next thing that we do is we look at your current monitoring and alerting setup. And do you have alerts that are appropriate for the type of incident management triggering that we're talking about here? If you have those, if they happen to be defined in CloudWatch, then we configure an event bridge which feeds that directly to our incident management platform and our incident management engineers. If you happen to use one of our great third-party monitoring partners and not have those alarms in CloudWatch yet, that's fine. We'll work with you and get those set up in CloudWatch as well. We're working on a future development where we can take alarms directly from some of those leading third-party providers into IDR. But in the initial GA service as of September, CloudWatch and EventBridge are the foundations for that feed. Okay? So once we get those alarms agreed to between the application, the customer, and the AWS team, we get those tested. The final step is looking at what are your runbooks. What do you do today when problems begin to evolve? And we make sure that you have the runbooks on your side, we have runbooks on our side for our incident response team that say how are we going to guide you through these things should they occur. In the AWS case, we implement our runbooks in the AWS Simple Systems Manager service so that our runbooks are automated to the greatest degree possible so that the communication and coordination that happens is repeatable and reliable and happens very quickly during an incident. So that's how the onboarding process looks. So once customers have adopted this service and have been onboarded to it, what value have they been seeing from it? We've been doing this with beta customers throughout the year and with production customers since September. So what are some of the benefits? From an observability standpoint, I'm sure you all know that implementing reliable alerting on complex distributed systems is hard. There's many stacks, there's many components, different API entry points, many different metrics, some of which are good indicators of customer impacting problems, some of which are not. So picking those out to have reliable signals and indicators is a difficult problem. What we have found is that doing this in tandem with the customer, with your expertise about your application and your monitors, and bringing our AWS experts to bear as well, we end up with a richer, deeper set of monitors in place for IDR-enabled customers, and so that's one benefit. A second benefit is that early incident detection piece that I tried to indicate before. Getting rid of the initial manual diagnosis and triggering things earlier, triggering it directly to 24/7 teams that we have around the world that are already monitoring our services. In terms of faster resolution time, several things are leading to that value. The time that we spend together working on the alarms and working on the playbooks results in incidents being diagnosed faster. The fact that we can bring, because we're looking at our telemetry of what services may be involved, we can bring the right engineers into the call from the beginning rather than waiting for escalations later to bring them in. And so we've got the right people on the phone faster with the right data in front of them, and that all leads to a much quicker resolution of incidents. The final value comes from a continuous improvement standpoint. So once we've been through one of these incidents, we will produce a post-incident report for you that tells what happened, what were the steps, how long did each take, and we can use that to drive corrective action and figure out how we can avoid this next time and make sure you don't have any repeat incidents. So those are some of the values that customers are seeing from onboarding to this IDR service. So just to wrap up this section on the offering before I hand it off to Michael, let's go back to that 5-hour recovery time and look at, again, let's get behind what that is and how does IDR as a service actually help decrease that very significantly? So assume you have an application, it's stood up all or in part on AWS. You've got your application alarms on your side that feed your teams in terms of what's going on at the application layer. Our services are obviously instrumented and have telemetry of what's going on with them. So say a problem begins to evolve, whatever the source might be, application problem, AWS service problem. Alarms begin to trigger in different places, right? At some point, you begin a customer investigation to find out, okay, what's going on here? You're looking at recent changes, what's causing this? Is it a problem in our infrastructure? Is it a problem in AWS? And at some point, you're gonna look at some log entry or some metric and say, okay, I think this is an AWS problem. I need help resolving this from AWS. You're gonna open an appropriate support case to the right team to deal with that. That gets us down to the white box. Our experience from our measurements suggests that is usually in the range of 2 to 3 hours from the initial trigger to the initial customer investigation to the time that they're convinced that AWS needs to help with the problem and opens a support case. So at that point, your technical account managers are getting paged out. We're all on a bridge together. We're doing a joint investigation in the blue phase. There may be pipelines on both sides that may need to be rolled back to deal with the problem. There may be multiple mitigation paths that we're investigating to try to resolve whatever the root cause of the incident is. And eventually we find one that works, we fix the problem, things are recovered, everything is great. That second half from the white bar on down takes another 2 to 3 hours on average. So you put together the front-end investigation and the back-end joint investigation, and that's where your 5 hours can typically come from, even for a well-instrumented, well-prepared kind of app. So how does IDR help with that? Well, as I said before, IDR helps by short-circuiting the whole top half of that investigation. By the alarms that we've put in place, when they trigger, we already know there's a problem, and we have some indication of where the problem is, so the investigation can hopefully start in the right place and proceed much more quickly. You get right into that blue phase within 15 minutes or less, and that phase itself proceeds much more quickly because of the runbooks and the joint preparation that we've done through well-architected, et cetera. And our experience through the deployment of this offering is that, as you would expect, it results in much shorter response times for customers, or recovery times rather. And we've actually had some of our customers tell us that the telemetry that we've agreed to and set up has actually helped them detect things and resolve them before they actually became customer impacting problems at all. So you move from the range of detection to prevention, which obviously is the ultimate goal. So that's a little bit about incident detection and response and why we created and what we're seeing from it. I'd like to turn the podium over to my friend Mr. Proctor and hear about the amazing migration of Chase.com that happened this year and how IDR was part of that.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everybody, and again, thank you for spending time with us today. So Tom described something that I think will resonate with so many people. You know, the ability to know that at some point in your triaging of an incident, that you don't have to make a call, open a case, try to describe to somebody who doesn't know your infrastructure necessarily or hasn't really spent time in your alerting what the problem is, while you're also simultaneously trying to do a bunch of other things. So I think that will resonate. I think as well that the important component around preparedness is really critical. And so having a good sense of how you can be prepared, not just in the, we'll hand this off to AWS and partner with them, but in the sense of actually going through processes and pre-production activity that will leave you with a sense of confidence that you can move forward. So at Chase, we spend a lot of time thinking about scale, the impacts, et cetera, and have a really solid view of what operational excellence is. And so a lot of what we're talking about really falls into this operational excellence concept of making sure that we can be as prepared as we can be. So I'm sure you have measures as well that you use, KPIs perhaps, that tell you how many customers were impacted in a specific issue, how long it took to mitigate and repair, and some of those numbers that Tom showed us on the previous slide. We do the same, and I think driving towards making those better all the time is something that any organization, no matter of any size, is really going to focus upon. So I'm going to try to share some learnings in the preparation and the processing that we did prior to going live with the migration that Tom talks about. And basically this was it's our digital front end. It services both Chase.com and our Chase mobile app, largely an Apache Tomcat-based deployment. And we'll talk about the specifics of that deployment in a little while, but that's the context of the discussion. Before I jump forward, just a quick show of hands, who is already a Chase customer, either through banking, investments, credit card, lending products, etc.? Thank you for being a customer. And I don't ask the question out of simple curiosity, and I'm not going to chase anybody who didn't raise their hand and offer you a product or anything like that. It's really around scale, and I think scale is important for a lot of different institutions. Either you have a very niche market or you have a very broad market, you have competitors, etc. Right? So the scale that you're at now and the scale where you would like to be is important in how you strategize to move forward. The scale that you can see here, speaking about Chase as a whole, I think is relatively large by any standard. We have over 250,000 employees across the globe. As you can see, have relationships in the US with 1 in 2 households. That's why the hands were roughly 1 in 2, I would say, maybe a little bit less. And then just 2 other metrics speaking about the amount of payments that are processed in a period of time to give you a sense again of the scale. But JPMC, or JPMorgan Chase, is not a monolith. We actually comprised of 4 major lines of business, 8 different corporate groups, and the lines of business are very focused on different customer segments and the needs that they have. I'll run through them very quickly because I think it gives a sense of context in this discussion. First, we have the consumer and community banking. That's really the one that's focused on the US, handles all your retail activity. As you can see, we have branches in all the 48 states, the lower 48 states, and you can access your banking or complete your banking requirements really in any way you choose. Branches, through the telephone, ATMs are pretty versatile. And then increasingly and more, I think we're seeing digital adoption through either chase.com or the mobile app. We also have the corporate and investment bank, well known as the JPMorgan brand, something that you can see provides advice and such to corporate customers in over 100 countries. We have asset and wealth management, which is very focused on customers with very specific financial needs. And then we have the commercial bank, which is focused on businesses in over 20 countries around the world. Now, none of this would be possible without global technology, and I think I indicated global technology is one of the corporate groups. And resiliency and preparedness, I think, as I said, falling into operational excellence is really one of the cornerstones for trying to make sure that we can grow our base and grow our presence and grow the brands. Looking then at global technology, and global technology here, not just the name of the corporate group, but also the way we've constructed technology around the world. I think you can see, based on just a few metrics that are on the screen, it's large as well by any size. It's 20% of the workforce actually has an IT role of one nature or another. We have 6,400 applications in production, and you can see there the number of active digital customers and so on. Now, with that many applications, with that many customers, you can imagine that the opportunity for things to go wrong and for customer impacts to grow really quickly is large. And so being prepared quickly means that we can avoid some of those things that Tom showed. We don't want to be the guy holding the dominoes, and we certainly don't want to be seeing our name in print because of some major issue that occurred. So the importance of making sure we can prepare, I think, is quite significant. There are a couple of strategies or strategic pillars inside of global technology that I'd just like to touch on quickly. First one is products, platforms, and experiences, and this goes to supporting business needs for differentiated experiences. Obviously, we're all in competitive spaces, and being able to rapidly deploy and implement new releases. Software development and infrastructure, looking here specifically in this context and at AWS about adopting Elastic Cloud and making sure that we can leverage for our deployments and as well as our engineering to bring a lot of acceleration to it, given comparing it to some of our on-prem deployments. You've heard a lot about data and about the importance of data throughout the conference. Yesterday's keynote had a big chunk about data, clearly unlocking the power of data, not just for customer purposes, but as Tom was saying, the telemetry and the importance of knowing that you can establish with confidence what the health of your application is, what the health of your workload and the infrastructure is important. But none of this would be possible without the ability to protect customers and the firm as a whole. We all know the world we live in terms of threats, etc. So embedding security and privacy at every layer is really critical. So I'm almost at a point where we'll see a slide that has AWS icons and stuff, so just give us a couple of minutes there. The Chase.com migration, I think, is critical, and I know that a lot of folk who've attended some of the CTO talk on Monday around how you choose what you're going to send to the cloud is important. So I'm going to touch very quickly on why the Chase.com migration really made sense to us, and it really fulfilled a bunch of the strategic priorities that technology has and can support the business with. First is the leveraging of data and technology, and we touched on that on the slide before, but the ability to actually take advantage of what the cloud offers is clearly critical. Driving customer engagement through enhanced experiences, and clearly the reverse of that is true. Whenever you have an outage or you have some sort of failure, you're reducing your customer engagement and you're placing friction in front of them, and at some point you're going to lose a customer. Building around very dedicated, very specific protections that will take care of the security that we require for maintaining a very strong and well-regulated controls and risk environment is important, and being able to adopt various cloud-specific techniques there is important as well. And finally, and it may not seem intuitive, but the whole idea of focusing on the employee experience, especially on engineers and others in the technology space, of making sure that we can reduce friction, and we've heard this in other talks through the last couple of days, reducing friction of having to manually do the same task repetitively, of taking time to get things into production or going through loads of hoops. I think we see a lot of opportunity by adopting the cloud for this specific application and others that will follow in that regard. So the Chase.com migration had several demanding objectives that were outside of the strategic priorities. We're moving out of some legacy data centers. The ability to be able to deliver at the same speed and with the same metrics or better than those data centers was clearly important. Here we're focusing on an objective of 4 nines of availability, and I know availability is critical. I saw all the hands go up a little earlier. Clearly cost is a factor, and it'll be a factor for any size organization. But also the ability to engineer the end-to-end solution was really paramount, making sure that we can automate specifically things like our deployments, our component releases, the self-healing and mitigation, in order to try to avoid some of the things that Tom was talking about earlier, and also testing and validation and certification. The objective was to complete this program by the end of 2022. We actually completed the migration of our last customer wave in late October. The total volume of customers migrated, and I should say we didn't migrate data into the cloud, we migrated the processes that pointed customers to various infrastructure to drive all of that, all those sessions, all of that activity through the cloud. It was 100 million customers. So 100 million profiles now point all of those customer sessions to run into the cloud, even though not everybody is active as you saw some of the earlier numbers. I'm going to quickly just touch on the preparedness that Tom spoke about, and he spoke about resiliency testing and the like, and just share with you how we process through the engagement. And I must also note that the team that was built to complete this migration was above and beyond just the application team owning it. There was a broad range of people from a wide range of components of Chase, as well as AWS and our ProServe colleagues that have partnered to make this a reality. We also engaged the digital SRE team to really focus on the observability and the resiliency component of it. And to that end, we started with a failure modes and effects analysis. So this is a way of producing a complete inventory of all the failure modes you might anticipate in an environment, in both the application as well as the infrastructure, of making sure you're understanding of what might trigger those events, what you would do to mitigate them, what the potential is for them to happen, and that can sometimes be a swag, but it's still an important thing to have, what your projected outcomes would be in terms of customer impacts, and to use those attributes as a way of trying to rank different failure modes against each other and to then focus on the ones that are the most important. And once you have the ability to lay out the failure modes and you've ranked them, to then work through building scenarios that will help you take care of the how. How will you trigger them? How will you know they've happened? How will you assess the impacts? And sometimes that requires more than just documenting it. It's actually building processes that will do that. Having the scenarios then leads to scheduled game days. And I think Tom mentioned the word game day, and that's really an important component of this entire cycle. And that's basically scheduling an event with a series of scenarios potentially where you can engage all the appropriate stakeholders from the application teams, the architects, etc., as well as the operational teams, to all have the experience of what goes on when something fails. And to do so outside of the realm of when customers are really impacted and are going to be aware of the fact that you've got a problem. And to spend time working through those scenarios, driving them, leveraging tools such as Gremlin or AWS's fault injection system to inject the failures that you see, and then work towards a process where you can do a post-mortem, the same kind of thing you would do in a production space. But to do so really focused on not just the nature of the failure or the architecture, but the application, the documentation, how you would respond to things, and obviously the detection and such as well. Hopefully at the back end of that, you come up with a bunch of improvements, especially if this is an early adoption of a cloud deployment and you're working through potential alternatives to the way that you might do your deployment. Building the solutions or building improvements, deploying them and retesting them is critical, obviously. And at the same time, you may also need to revise your FMEA, so to revise your failure modes and effects analysis, because you may have potentially reduced a failure mode by the improvements you've got, or even potentially have increased one or added to it. And once you feel comfortable that you've accomplished the insights or you've gained the insights you need, you've perfected it as much as you can for those specific failure modes, is to then iterate and to expand your scope to go through failure modes that maybe didn't make it into the first wave. Those are all important ways of doing this on a regular basis. And we created a bunch of scenarios that we tagged as certification scenarios, and we run them as certification game days, and we run them deliberately at the point where we expect to have large releases, where we've had component level upgrades, EKS upgrades, things like that, as well as running them in production once a month. And that took some doing in terms of actually trying to get them run in production. I should say, by way of disclosure, that the sharded version of our customer base that experiences these production failures through these game days are employee accounts, and everybody who did so volunteered to do so. But at some point, I think the goal is that we would be able to run these kinds of certification tests in a production environment, knowing that the impacts to customers would be zero because of the mitigation steps and our telemetry and all the processes we've built around it. Now let's jump into looking at the architecture of Chase.com. And this is a fairly busy slide, but I'm sure it'll resonate with you as well. As I indicated, we have a sharded solution, so sharded customer base with multi-account, multi-region, multi-AZ, and the philosophy of making sure that we can have as much redundancy and isolation as possible so that we can minimize blast radius impacts for any issue that does occur. Up front of the application VPC, we've got multiple layers of security and services that help take care of our inputs. You can see Route 53 there as well. The application layer is built out of a series of pods inside of EKS, running Kubernetes, obviously. And that's where we have the full application layer. The managed services that we rely on, apart from the ones that are already indicated, specifically are around Elastic Cache and RDS for the small amount of data that we require to be able to operate our system. But the bulk of our activity in terms of fulfilling customer requests occurs at the back end in our corporate data centers, and that's plural. And you can also see the focus on redundancy in terms of some of the icons on the diagram. And then from an operational point of view, underpinning all of that really are a load of functions and just working to them from left to right. We run a lot of synthetics. Many of them are driven out of our digital robotics team that run tests both in the pre-production space as well as production, giving us good signals and insights into how our processes are performing. We leverage that with Thousand Eyes and with Dynatrace as well. On Chaos Test Services, both in pre-production and production, and in the cloud and on-prem, we leverage Gremlin. We also have a series of scripts and other bespoke solutions that we've written to supplement what Gremlin does for us. From the monitoring point of view, we've made sure that we've built monitors to cover all the failure modes that were built out of our FMEA, as well as to provide roll-ups and aggregations of what we can see in terms of both workload and health for the infrastructure. And we've done that in multiple different tools. People may wonder why the multiple tools, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But we rely in the cloud on Datadog, supplemented by CloudWatch. On-prem, we have Splunk and Dynatrace and a bespoke operationals portal. Dynatrace, though, is also deployed in our cloud environment, so it gives us the ability to trace and to connect the dots between a lot of the processing that occurs in the cloud deep into our on-prem infrastructure and the services that are hosted there. The monitoring platforms that we have all basically emit alerts and signals into our corporate alert hub, and therefore seamlessly into our corporate incident management process. So like Tom described, a pretty robust, comprehensive AWS incident management process. We believe we have a very similar one, and that is critical in terms of getting signals to the right people at the right time. Not described here, but important to note is we have a series of automated processes to assess health, like a health check service, both for the infrastructure as well as the application. And that gives us the ability to automatically route traffic appropriately when needed. Because of the multi-region and the multi-AZ components of it, we're able to route traffic away from environments that are experiencing an issue. So we'll focus on having our sessions run in primary regions compared to secondary, but we always have the redundancy that we can fail over to the secondary region. That becomes helpful and useful, at least at this stage in our progression, in order to ensure that our deployments can be successfully tested prior to customer traffic actually running through them. So it's clear from, and finally, the same structures that you see here are created and deployed in our pre-production environments. And that gives us, the resiliency testing opportunities that I mentioned a moment ago, where we can really run under performance load, mimicking customer traffic in production. We can run our resiliency tests and our performance tests, and to run the resiliency tests under load. I think that's really important because you can get a really good sense of whether your expectations were correct in terms of both the resiliency as well as the impacts and your mitigation strategies, and the fact that you can detect and observe these issues promptly. So building it out across your platforms is really important. Now, it's clear from the number of components that you see here and from this logical groupings of infrastructure that multiple teams could get involved in the event that we have an issue. And that's true. We have a multi-tiered, multi-level support structure today. At its heart is a mission control group that is on-prem 24/7 in multiple places in the world, and that are co-located with various IT disciplines to really allow us to respond as fast as possible. And their primary role is to mitigate an incident and to escalate appropriately as needed. So we expanded that to include additional support teams inside of Chase, and obviously the expansion goes to what Tom described earlier in terms of IDR. I'm sorry, my notes have disappeared below the bottom here, and I'm struggling to find them. I don't want to leave anything out. So as Tom indicated, because of our focus on operational excellence, because of our requirement and our need to ensure that we can resolve issues as fast as we can, and to expand the tooling that's available to us, we went through the process of working through the well-architected review that Tom described, and we chose to adopt and onboard to the IDR offering. And by doing so, working with them in terms of creating the appropriate CloudWatch alerts, identifying the signals, collaborating on runbooks and what various signals will mean and how we would respond and how we would be supported was really important. Additionally, doing connections in terms of communication and status is critical as well. So you don't just get a call out the blue. You're aware of how this process will flow, and it doesn't interrupt your triaging activities. We're at the point now in the migration, as I indicated, the customer migration was completed in October, of working through the remaining activity that is processing in our legacy infrastructure for this application. And we're considering at this stage that we've been very successful and have accomplished the goals that we wanted to. Obviously, it's not a single journey. We're not at the destination. There's a lot of work to be done going forward. But the iterative processing and the continual focus on improvement that you can gain through doing resiliency activities, through the resiliency tests, through ongoing training and awareness of the support teams is not going to stop. And it will be a foundation not just for this application, but for other applications that are going to migrate to the cloud in the coming year. Finally, we spoke a little bit about the multiple platforms that help us with our observability, and we have Datadog, Splunk, Dynatrace, and others, and people will say, well, why would you do that? Some of it is legacy. I know people who've worked in organizations that are large and perhaps have had a long presence in an IT space will have legacy platforms that they're bringing forward with them. That's part of it, but also they tend to focus on very specific needs. And I'm not saying this is our end solution by any means, but it's a great step forward that helps us leverage what we know, adopt things that are brand new to us, and then work through the process of refining that as time passes. And that's a journey that I think we're still well underway with. So looking then at best practices, calls to action, I'll take the best practices and Tom will return to look at the call to action, and then we'll be happy to take questions. Clearly, having a very clear sense of the measures that you need to be able to determine whether or not there's business impact is important. I think that came up a lot in what Tom said. It's certainly been something that we've had to focus on as well. We've heard in other talks just the volume of telemetry that comes out of the cloud environment, plus all the additional metrics and such that you will get out of your application, along with logs and the like, can really make it a bit daunting to determine which are the signals that will really help you out. You can have literally hundreds and hundreds of metrics that you need to wade through in any normal deployment in the cloud. It reminds me a little bit of, and if I may borrow from, the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, where the mariner's sitting in a becalmed ocean. All he can see is water from end to end, and he and his crew are all dying of thirst. And he says, water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. It's a little bit the same for technology, where we can have metrics, fill my screen, nor is there sense in that. Because if you can't gain the sense out of what the metrics tell you, if you can't get the insights you need to be able to really understand what's going on and what the health of your workload and your infrastructure is, then you'll be at a loss, and that can be especially bad when you're trying to triage an issue. Business impact is also a very important component. I think maturity in terms of alerting really focuses on not just the binary up or down of a service, but what's the business impact potentially associated with that up or down. We also need to alarm to IDR and to the corporate support teams at the same time. This is a partnership and it's a progression. There's a lot of runbooks that we have that will be supplemented by what IDR can do for us. But certainly IDR is not intended, nor would we want it to be, the first line of defense in any issue that we experience. Again, a maturity component, alarming at multiple levels, not just at workload, at an ALB perhaps, or components here that may have failed some liveliness check, but rather trying to do that in a structured way that would give you better insights into where things might be happening. And if you can correlate some of the signals, it really gives you a much better indication of how a segment of your processing perhaps, or a segment of your request structures might be failing because of a certain issue in a component or even a back-end system. Being able to validate runbooks, and again, going through the resiliency testing, because there's nothing like practice to really help you determine whether or not something's working as you expect, to help you with the tooling that you would otherwise be relying upon in a crisis, is important. But it also helps you go through the runbooks, the communication paths, brings familiarity to people on both the corporate side as well as on the AWS IDR side. And finally, I'd say, the alerting and the tuning of your alerts needs a little bit of time to bake in production. And so you need a little time for that to happen. No matter how comprehensive the performance testing can be and how much you try to mimic what your production activity is in terms of customer behavior, you're going to find instances where that changes. And it can especially change under the threat of an incident, or when an incident is unfolding. Customers will retry, or traffic will move inadvertently somewhere else. And just the ability to know how to catch those signals is really important. So with that, I would just close by saying the well-architected review, which Tom mentioned and I think I touched on earlier as well, is really a great place to start. It gives you a nice comprehensive view of things that you can take care of and areas you should be focused upon. Engaging with AWS in that process is even more valuable, given their insights into the processing as well. And there's some segments that focus very specifically on different business domains, like financial services. So with that, here's Tom for the closing and the call to action.
Okay, thank you, Michael, so much for the experience and sharing that with us today. Okay, so you've heard what IDR is, why we built it, and you've heard from one of our largest customers about their experience implementing it. So I hope that that has been helpful. So where do we go forward from here? How can this help you? So this chart here is trying to show how you can think about applying some of these lessons learned to your own environments. So it starts with looking through your portfolio and your applications and deciding which critical applications would benefit from the type of increased responsiveness that we talked about here today. I think the key thing, like in many things, is start somewhere. You may not have a digital platform that serves hundreds of millions of users at a time, but you've got something that's critical to your business. So start with that. Go through the orderly life cycle that Michael showed you in terms of the reviews and the testing and all of that. If you're interested in using IDR as a mechanism to help formalize and drive that forward, certainly talk to your account team, to your TAMs. We'd be happy to work with you on that. And since we're here in Vegas, I'm going to use a gambling analogy and say, be prepared. Don't gamble with your customer experience or the availability of your application. All right, so just to wrap things up, if you're looking for information, we've got some good pages out here that can give you more information on IDR, and that will be available in the deck. Most interestingly might be, we've talked a little bit about the value of the offering. You might have some questions about cost for value. There's a pricing page that describes how IDR is priced, and to just summarize it in a nutshell, it's very similar to the pricing of enterprise support, tiered model based on usage. It's roughly about 40% of the base cost of enterprise support. So if you want to talk more about scenarios, they're happy to do that after the talk here. And the FAQ as well has some great frequently asked questions that you can review at your leisure. So with that, we will open it to questions.